And thanks for joining us.
Yes.
Anthony, today we'd like to address an important issue that is really affecting more and more people every single day, the consequences of finding out you're what's called an accidental American.
Yeah, I mean, with a lot of people wanting to become Americans, people sneaking over the border and the lines, people want to become Americans, but there's some people who don't want to be Americans because the consequences are kind of crappy.
Yeah, when it comes to tax consequences, for sure. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in the past. Today, we're joined by a special guest who's worked hand in hand with people who have had this issue, Keith Redmond. We had Keith on last week to discuss some of the issues Americans who live and work overseas experience. While today we'll be focusing on accidental Americans, we will like to have Keith back again, because there's so many issues we need to talk about. The difficulty of saving for retirement, insurance issues, problems that self-employed overseas have, but today specifically accidental Americans. Now, Keith is an international senior consultant at Leadership Across Borders. He's worked in the life sciences industry globally for 20 plus years doing communications, advocacy, and government relations work. He's a founding member of Circle K2, an international think tank, and he does tons of work globally to address the serious issues affecting the 9 million Americans approximately living overseas and the associated populations. He works his butt off. He really does to address the insane taxation issues like the U.S. practice of Citizenship Based Taxation, FATCA, and how U.S. nationality laws affect accidental Americans, which is what we're going to focus on today. So, Keith, hello, and I want to say thank you for joining us again.
Hello, how are you?
So far, so good.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I know we're going to talk about accidental Americans today, but I know you're working on a lot of exciting things and a potential tax bill, and hopefully we'll get that in a later episode. So here we are, our accidental Americans. So, Keith, what's an accidental American?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting term because, prior to about 4 years ago, with the commencement of the implementation of FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, nobody really talked about accidental Americans. And it is an exponentially growing population as a result of FATCA. To put it in its very basic, simple terms, an accidental American is someone who is born in the United States to non-American parents. So I'll give the example of France. Two French parents in the United States, they have a child born there. That child, they leave when the child is either in diapers or 1 or 2 or 3 years of age. That child has never had a U.S. passport, and yes, you can leave the United States not on a U.S. passport, even when you're born in the U.S., because it's not uniformly applied. They've never had a U.S. passport, never had a Social Security number. They have zero link with the United States. They have never been back to the United States. They have no family in the United States. They have never worked there or educated there, nothing. All of a sudden, fast forward in this day and age of FATCA, they receive a letter from their local bank, again using the example of France, stating that they have been identified as a U.S. person because of their place of birth. And as a result, they need to, one, waive their privacy as it pertains to France. Two, either supply a U.S. Social Security number or a certificate of loss of nationality, commonly known as a CLN. Of course, they have neither. They don't have a Social Security number, and they don't have a certificate of loss of nationality because they never knew they were American. And if they don't supply this, they will have their bank account closed.
Wow.
So they are put in a very difficult situation. And not only by it being identified as a U.S. person by that bank, what that means is moving forward, doing any type of business with any other institution in their country of residence, they will be identified as a U.S. person. And in this world of FATCA now, their access to financial products, whether that be investments or retirement, are either severely limited or closed. And so within their own country, they are a second-class citizen.
Wow.
Now,
so because of FATCA, and this is one of the most egregious elements of FATCA, is the identification of this individual in this population, which is growing by leaps and bounds.
We might be jumping ahead a little bit, but if someone is an accidental American and gets a FATCA letter, complying with the tax code doesn't get rid of the FATCA issue.
What do you mean by that question so I can respond properly?
So let's say that somebody gets the FATCA letter from their bank, and it says, provide us with a social security number and show us, you're in compliance. And so the person says, okay, I guess I'll start complying with the U.S. tax code to get a social security number. And No,
that doesn't work that way. Sorry. Number one, the majority of the banks, at least with the exception of Switzerland, the majority of the banks are not asking for proof that you are in compliance with the U.S. tax system.
Okay.
Oh,
what
no
they
kidding.
are asking for is for a social security number for the W-9 form to be filled out so they have on file. So should they accumulate wealth and they're over the threshold of $50,000, their accounts are reported to the IRS.
Okay. You know why? Because I think we're used to, there's a different type of FATCA letter our typical client gets, and that's one where, hey, we noticed that you are a U.S. person and you have this large account. You need, due to information sharing, you need to allow us to disclose this to the IRS or show us proof that you're in compliance, or we will disclose this to the IRS. And so that's the sort of typical FATCA letter that sparks someone to call us to say, oh boy, I have a big problem. But those are people who aren't your accidental Americans usually. So I think it's a different type of FATCA letter you're referring to, that the request for information.
Right, it's a standard FATCA letter, and that's when the accidental American has their oh my God moment. And a lot of times, believe it or not, globally, they give me a call, and the first question is, Mr. Redmond, am I really an American?
It's insane. You know what I was surprised with as well, Keith, is that green card holders who moved back to their country of origin and let their green cards expire without formally canceling their U.S. immigration status still have to pay the taxes. So there's an actual form you fill out.
That's another bucket that certainly can be talked about. But they can certainly fly under the radar, so to speak.
Yep.
But with the accidental American, here are the choices that they have, and I'll tell you what the reality on the ground is. Within the IGAs, there's a line item at the loss of any other term or clause where you can self-certify with your bank, to state that under honor that you are not a U.S. person. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the bank will accept it, sometimes they won't. If they accept it, wonderful. If they do not, then the individual is obliged to either first recognize their U.S. citizenship so they can renounce their U.S. citizenship, but that also requires 5 years. Is it 5 years, 6 years?
It's 5 years of 5 years. You have to certify 5 years of compliance. Yeah, but in order
6 years of FBARs.
Right. But in order to do that, sometimes, depending on what it is, you might actually have to go back further. If depending on which program, if you're typically most people it's going to be 5 years. Though I would say that's a general rule.
Right, on average, let's say that.
Yep.
So they actually have to recognize that they're Americans so they can get out of being American. That's avenue number one, which for a lot of these people, they are ordinary folk. They don't have the $2,350 to even for the renouncement fee, and they don't even have the money to go to the tax compliance professional to take care of these back taxes to a country with which they have no link.
Right, and I've heard so many.
The trend has been.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, last point. The trend has been now. And the International Division of the Social Security Administration is very well aware of this, is that they will go ahead and apply for a Social Security number for the sole purpose of satisfying their local bank. And that's where they stop. They will do nothing further. And that's what our recommendation is. And what I mean by our is, as I work closely with an organization that is fighting for the rights of accidental Americans. And there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes. It has been addressed in the most recent French Commission report examining the plight of accidental Americans who are French citizens. So the pushback is beginning against the United States in this regard. Because remember, these individuals do not have a U.S. tax compliance problem. They have a U.S. citizenship problem.
Yes. And, I saw a story in particular of a German woman who found out she was an accidental American. And Keith, to see what she had to go through, what she's still going through from what I could ascertain, to, get her Social Security information and all her bank account information and file tax returns to renounce her citizenship. She doesn't speak the language. She doesn't have any inkling of English. She would try to reach out to the IRS for assistance or, people in the United States, but they couldn't assist her. It was so heart-wrenching to watch this poor woman try to muddle through this insane mess. And I did verify, Keith, that in the United States, if you're born in an airplane in U.S. airspace or on a boat in U.S. waters, you are an American. I know we had talked about that.
Okay, we had spoken about that
Yes.
on the last podcast.
Okay, now ways that accidental Americans discover this unwanted citizenship. Now, you'd mentioned the FATCA letter. Is that the only way they may find out? What are some other ways?
Well, that seems to be the main way in which they find out. Otherwise, it could be from word of mouth, talking to others. But usually it's because of the letter they receive from their bank.
Okay.
And they realize because of the unfortunate life event of being born in the United States, they are forever tied to the U.S. tax system.
Yes.
And so it is a major, oh my God, moment for them.
Now, you had mentioned, that they're going to have bank issues. What are some other issues that may come up, because of this unwanted citizenship?
Well, some of the issues that come up is the inability of having a bank account, maybe at another bank, should they choose to go to another bank, the inability to invest in their country.
Wow.
The inability of getting a mortgage, depending on the type of position they go after. If it's a financial position with a company, the inability of getting that employment because they're identified as a U.S. person, the inability to save properly for retirement. And this is all if they choose to enter the U.S. tax compliance system, because it's not done in a vacuum. It's not done just once. They would have to move forward doing so. Now, obviously, each case has to be weighted on its own merits.
Yes.
But generally speaking, moving forward in one's life, you accumulate wealth. And as you accumulate wealth under the U.S. practice of citizenship based taxation, and you're an identified U.S. person outside the United States, it's highly problematic that you're going to be able to save properly for a house or for your retirement.
Yeah.
So they're being treated just like an American overseas,
Right.
without the knowledge of being an American citizen.
Right. Now, you had mentioned that I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Noda case?
Well, it's a concept, and it is a case. It's as it relates to effective dominant nationality. And what that is the concept of effective dominant nationality was developed in 1957 by the International Court of Justice, to which the U.S. is a signatory. And the objective is to determine the true nationality of a dual citizen. And the name of this very famous case is the Noda decision, which is now called the Noda principle. And what it states is that in the case of an individual who holds two nationalities for legal purposes, his effective and dominant nationality is the nationality of the country where he or she resides, has family, has his main business or economic interests, and main social and cultural ties. So obviously, within the framework of this discussion, for the accidental American who happens to be, again, a French citizen, but he could be a German citizen, British citizen, Australian citizen, it's going to be the country in which he grew up, ergo France. Therefore, that nationality supersedes his quote-unquote U.S. personhood. And there have been a number of cases which have been decided based on the Noda principle, where that nationality is the dominant nationality, where that person lives. And it's interesting because we have pushed the U.S. State Department for clarification on this.
Yeah.
And they have given this I wouldn't say superfluous, but this ambiguous, roundabout type of, very fluid type of answer when it comes to this. And in my opinion, knowing full well the applications of this could be quite significant when it comes to not only dual nationals, but the situation with accidental Americans.
Yeah. Now, Keith, something you said really struck me. The accidental American does not have a U.S. tax compliance problem. They have a U.S. citizenship problem. And this sort of brings us to, I agree. That just saying I agree brings us to an interesting point that Anthony was talking about. Being tax compliance attorneys, you get put in sort of a weird spot.
Yes.
I would say that, someone, an accidental, I wish people understood the perspective, or they could understand the perspective of what a U.S. tax attorney has to advise. Of course, they're not from the U.S., so they don't necessarily know what the rules are. Around the world, attorneys have different roles that, depending on what country you're in, your attorney might not be 100% your advocate. And in the United States, I'm not really allowed to advise something other than compliance with the law. If you do something wrong, it's subjected to the attorney-client privilege, and that's between you and me, and that's in the past. But anything going in the future, I really can't advise you to do, because this is really how I've always done business. I'm maybe a little bit paranoid, but I imagine that anybody who's calling me, anyone who meets with me, could potentially be wearing a wire, and they could be a government operative looking to catch me on a conspiracy charge of where I'm assisting people in hiding assets or whatever the case is. And unfortunately, there's a lot of attorneys who are taken down by things. I've seen, I've seen a lot of attorneys who really weren't doing a lot of things wrong, but they just were caught with bad facts, and they ended up having to take a plea, or something really terrible has happened. That we are at battle with the government here, and I can't really 100% tell you the advice I want to tell you. I can't say there's no friggin' way that they're going to get you, but I could say, well, let's look at the risks. Well, let's think about how this is really going to work. They would have to go, in France, they would have to go and prosecute you, I guess, in absenteeisha, or get your extradition. Where if they tried to do that in France, I mean, the blowback on that would that would be
they would not be extradited to the United States, and even if they were, a judgment was rendered in absentia in the United States, they would have to get that judgment transferred to a French court. And remember, that individual is a French citizen, and it's highly unlikely, especially the majority of these accidental Americans are average folk. It's highly unlikely that the French court is going to rule in favor of the U.S. government or the IRS to go after this one particular individual. And number two, the cost effectiveness of getting the Department of Justice involved and the attorneys involved, and to go after somebody who makes maybe $40,000 a year is highly unlikely. And also the French system, they are not going to go after their bank accounts and freeze their bank accounts. So it really has to be taken a look at what is the true reality on the ground and a pragmatic approach. But there's something interesting that you stated where you have to tell them about the law. And what's interesting in that is it's a question just to, for your responses, I assume you're meaning the U.S. law.
Right.
So that renders the question, they are in France.
Right.
So which law is applicable to them? The French law or the U.S. law? And
it's something where I can't quite give them an opinion, because who is the deciding, what's the jurisdiction of that? Because there's going to be, the U.S. may make a claim, and I could talk about what the U.S. claims would be, but I couldn't tell you what would ultimately prevail, because now I'll speak to an area of international law or French law where I'm not licensed to practice law in French. In France, it's something that I can't do. So I'm not going to give you a complete answer. I can give you what the government would do.
U.S. law is
right. I could give you that and how it would play out, but the complete picture, no, I can't. I really can't.
And I appreciate your candor, because it's very unfortunate. I have come across a number of U.S. tax professionals dealing with Americans overseas and also dealing with accidental Americans who will just blindly say you have to be U.S. tax compliant, because if you don't, you will be prosecuted criminally and you have the risk of going to jail. So the scaremongering is at the optimal level. And for these accidental Americans who think, oh my God, it's the United States of America and they're going to come after me, it puts the fear of God in them. And I cannot tell you how many times they get calls from very scared people, and I have to tell them to breathe and to just be still.
And generally,
you don't need to enter the U.S. tax compliance system.
I think some of our competition really, really likes the confusion part of the U.S. tax code because they can use it to their favor. They can ensure that they have a lot of business. I've heard Anthony say many a time, if FATCA went away, we'd find a new practice.
In fact, I mean, well, here's the other thing too. If any of these firms are listening here to us, this is going to be my suggestion to you. You might want to, because we've taken a look at a lot of your work, you might want to focus on your current compliance work and do that correctly before you go scaremongering other things, because you're incompetent. You're incompetent and you can't do what you already have. And now you're scaring people into things that they don't need to do because you think there's going to be additional revenue. So you can't even do the job. You can't even do the first job correctly. So don't worry about job number 2.
And I'll say, too, I think, you said some people may think, well, he's paranoid. People might be wearing a wire. No, really, we're pretty outspoken and vocal with videos and articles about how stupid we think these laws are. So some days I'm like, God, is there going to be a black car following me home today?
I do wonder sometimes. And that's where I have to be careful in what I say. And I don't want to, and it's unfortunate. I can't give people, exactly advice, because sometimes I would like to tell someone, look, you're different than everybody else. You really need to comply. And that if I could prove, look, there's some people I say not to comply. Okay. You're the one I'm telling you to comply. I can't really say, hey, there's some people I say, hey, everybody I tell them you have to comply, but you really need to comply.
And then that's why an organization was formed by a French citizen who's an accidental American to fight for the rights of accidental Americans, not just in France, but globally.
Oh, wow.
And that is one of our statements to these accidental Americans. Do not enter the system. Number one, from a practicality standpoint, you have no ties to the U.S. What are they going to do, revoke a passport that you never had in the first place? You have no desire to even go to the U.S. You've never been to the U.S. Don't do it. You earn your money where you live. You pay your taxes where you live, in France, in Germany, in Australia. And besides that, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to address the accidental American situation. It was even put into the Green Book by President Obama, the last Green Book, talking about the situation of accidental Americans. So he very well knows. And I know we're having a transition in administration, but it is down in writing that there's a serious problem with accidental Americans. Therefore, that if the accidental American does enter the U.S. tax compliance system, they are in the system, and there may not be any amnesty for them.
Yeah, and I would just, this is, you mentioned that most of the accidental Americans are just regular people, which is true. I've also I have spoken to a few in the Middle East who aren't really, your average person. And I just talked to them, they have substantial assets, and they're just more curious about, how things would work. And they're like, well, I'm really not worried about, extradition or anything like that because my uncle is, justice minister or something like that. And so there is a group of people out there that are sort of running the countries. And I would say this, to sort of illustrate the lunacy of this, is that there was someone who passed recently who was an accidental American who had substantial wealth, and that was the King of Thailand. He was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And
if I'm wrong, I think he was born to diplomats, and that's a different exception.
That is true. There is a diplomat exception, but Cambridge made me think that it wasn't, because it would be New York. Oh, that was before. That is true. Oh, so maybe he's not.
Maybe he's not.
That is correct. I believe he's not, because he was born to diplomats.
That's right. There is the diplomat. Right. So they have a nice exception, right?
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Right.
Okay. Now.
Exactly. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think it's very important, and this goes maybe to another podcast, is that if a baby is born to two non-American parents in the United States, they need to have something that accompanies their birth certificate on what the ramifications are of being born in the United States, and should you leave and live outside the borders of the U.S. This is what you're beholden to moving forward.
That's a really, really great idea.
And this is something where the U.S. government has been deficient, and I underscore deficient, in communicating this information.
Okay, now, let's say we all agree that, if you're an accidental American, it's a crappy situation, for tax compliance issues specifically. So can you outline some of the choices that they have, some of the actions they can take, or some of the actions they shouldn't take?
Well, certainly one action can be that they get in touch with the group that has been formed to fight for the rights of accidental Americans. And number one, if they happen to be on Facebook, they can certainly go to the Accidental American group page and join.
Yep.
And that's going to be facebook.com/groups/accidental Americans.
Okay.
And the founder of that group is the gentleman about whom I was speaking, who is fighting for the rights of accidental Americans, and I work very closely with him. My contact is Keith Redmond @outlook.com, and any accidental American who may be listening to this can certainly contact me, and I can put them in touch with the group.
Excellent. That's really good
so
too.
That's
because
number one, which is important because there's strength in numbers when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Now, as far as on the ground practicality, as I listed or stated earlier in the podcast, number one, if they can self-certify with their bank and the bank accepts it, perfect.
Great.
End of discussion. If they can't, then they can obtain a Social Security number, go through that process for the purpose and the sole purpose of satisfying the bank so they can retain their bank accounts where they live and stop there. That's it. Should they not feel comfortable with that, they can certainly go through the process of the renunciation, which means that they pay the $2,350 renunciation fee, file the back taxes, file the back years of FBARs, pay the tax compliance professional, and if they happen to be a covered expatriate, pay the exit tax and get out of it. And for many of these people, whether they be making a minimal salary or they happen to be someone who is wealthy, they will risk losing a significant portion of their savings. So it depends on the level of comfortability for each individual. But as I stated, again previously, the reality on the ground, are they going to come after these people in their countries of residence, specifically if they are citizens of that country? Are they going to extradite them to the United States? I think not.
No. So, yeah, if you are
Even
watching this at night and you just found out,
countries who have the mutual assistance program,
no,
I think not.
No.
Okay. All right. Well,
now, I'm saying a lot of things that are quite provocative here, and I'm sure once this podcast is put up, I'm going to get a lot of pushback, as I always do, from the U.S. tax compliance industry. But I stand my ground.
We agree with you.
Yes.
That there's enough people who are legitimate U.S. persons who have enough connection that have a real risk. Those are the people the compliance industry should be focusing on, or just waiting for. And again, just look at your current clients. And why don't you take another look at the returns, have someone else review them to see if everything is done correctly, because the returns that we see done by many of these firms, and including a big one, H&R Block, are routinely wrong. And they're always, they're presenting themselves as experts. And, they'll say they'll file any tax form for you, and they'll give you a low price, and it's impossible to do it. It's impossible to do the work correctly. Yet there they are, still out there claiming that they're the experts and looking for more people to hire them. And there's enough work to do with your current clients if you do it correctly.
Well said.
And I will just add another situation. I spoke with a gentleman who is an accidental American born to one British parent, one French parent, left the United States in diapers. And he got very scared. So he contacted a law firm, very well known. If I stated the name, everybody would know them. And that law firm, $50,000 later, the advice was, after submitting all the papers, was him to enter the offshore voluntary disclosure program. And I told him, stop. Do not do it.
Yeah.
You will be ruined.
Yeah.
And I put him in contact with, I said, if you want to go through with this, because he wanted to renounce and just get on with his life, I put him in contact with a reputable U.S. tax professional who knew how to deal specifically with this situation. And he paid a nominal amount to do what he needed to do. But it's just absolutely, at the loss of any other term, disgusting that even these global international law firms will fleece their clients.
Oh, we see it every day. And and not only do they fleece them, I guess that would be one part, but they do an incredibly poor job. So it's just terrible all around, and your heart goes out. Here's a person that's ruined. That if they came somewhere good, things could have worked out all right, and they were just they were pushed into this corner by the IRS, and then the tax compliance sort of pushed them down the stairs. That's.
So my advice to accidental Americans when they find out and have their oh my God moment that they are indeed an accidental American is to stop. Do not let the fear overcome you. Breathe. Take it step by step.
Yes.
Talk with the appropriate people. Do not talk with U.S. tax professionals from the get-go. Find out what the situation is. Contact me. Contact the Facebook group that I gave you. And to just move forward from there, because nothing has to be done in the immediate.
Yeah. Right. And, we see here at the firm, we see how this is tearing people's lives apart. And we're just so thankful for the work that you and your team are doing to help as many people as you can.
And I'm just one. You just happen to speak in one person. Yes, I'm very vocal about it, but there's a number of other people who are working on these issues as well.
Yeah.
So it's just extremely important. And I think another point is a lot of these accidental Americans, they don't even speak English.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? Is the IRS going to put all the documents into all the different languages around the world?
Of course not.
So that way they can be able to comply properly?
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Keith, you're going to be testifying in front of Congress, correct, to help fight FATCA?
That is the plan.
Okay, now this will be broadcast on C-SPAN, so when we get dates, we'll make sure we link to that so people can set their DVRs and hear the stories.
And we plan to have one of the witnesses as an accidental American.
Awesome.
And one in particular, a witness, and particularly one that doesn't speak English, so a translator will need to be used. And just for that purpose, it'll just show the absurdity of the situation.
I think it's very important for people to tune in and watch that, even if they're not an accidental American, to see how it's affecting people all over the world.
Yeah, because it'll be U.S. citizens as well, not just that just happens to be one bucket.
Yes.
A very egregious bucket,
yep.
But just one bucket of damage that's being done because FATCA puts on the front burner the serious problems with the U.S. practice of citizenship-based taxation.
Okay. Now, one more time, Keith, what's your email in case someone wants to reach out to you?
It'll be Keith, Keith _ Redmond, REDMOND, @outlook.com.
Awesome. And like I said, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can like and comment below. You can follow our channel because we definitely want to have Keith back to talk about, a lot of the issues that expats and those living and working overseas. We could probably do 100 of these videos. So I really want to thank you for your time, Keith. You're doing great work.
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak to you on this situation that's happening to this particular population.
All right. Well, thanks so much for watching.